Hi, welcome back to my sound booth as I take on Chapter 10 of my third novel, Super Ninja. Hopefully you came here to hear a story and maybe become inspired to tackle some of your own projects. Probably a little bit of that. Hey, if he can do it, I can probably do it too. And probably even better. If you've discovered me or this channel or my videos, you're probably scouring YouTube for some resources. And I do as well. And, if you came here because you thought you were going to get specific tips and tricks and how to use software or which microphone to use, this is probably not the place to find that. There are a lot of YouTubers or experts that I consider experts that are out there, and those are much better resources. So people like Jay Myers and the Microphone Assassin and Booth Junkies and Voiceover Blueprint, and if you're looking for software and how to use it, Lenny B and Thomas Boynton are fantastic resources, and I've learned a lot from all these people. And if you're looking to just see people do great work, probably not going to get to hear a whole book, but anything by interviews and in the booth with people like Scott Brick and Patrick Fraley and Barbara Rosenblatt and, my favorite, Rosamund Pike. I am just amazed all the time. And then, as I work on my voice, besides taking voice lessons and singing lessons, though you're not going to hear me sing, on YouTube, people like the Fairy Voice Mother and transvocal lessons. And, for inspiration and fun, Tony Plattis is, I try to watch and listen to these people all the time, and I learn a lot. So, but meanwhile, tackling Chapter 10 of my own book. And you get to hopefully learn from my mistakes and learn along with me. Chapter 10. Dr. Watanabe looked up from the handiwork on the operating table. It would be weeks before they knew if the new procedures had been successful, but his work was done for now. He'd let the other doctors finish. Midnight, and still men and women worked in the lab. They were nearing the end of this phase of work. The momentum and excitement of uncharted territory was a drug that propelled them forward. He looked at the faces behind the surgical mask. Many knew enough. He didn't even know their names. They fulfilled their roles and disappeared just as quickly. Few, like him, had been there from the beginning. They had relative freedom here, freedom to push the science. Of course, that meant working and living as virtual slaves inside the vast holdings their lords and masters controlled in the city. Some spent months inside the huge warehouse, living and sleeping in Spartan dormitories built under its roof, never venturing into the vibrant but decadent city they knew threatened from outside their steel walls. For most, isolation here was easier than being shuttled back and forth the 5 miles to the apartment buildings Funakoshi owned, and the increased scrutiny and paranoia that leaving the warehouse subjected them to. Besides, the work he was doing here was rewarding. He had no qualms about ethics or morality or where the science might lead them. He oft imagined the lives his work would save in the near future, the glory he'd bring to his people. Sometimes evolution needed a little help. Progress his peers in Japan and around the world would debate, for 1,000 years. Dr. Watanabe smiled. Rewarding in more ways than one. Soon he'd pack up and return to Japan, a wealthy man. You wouldn't notice the loose metal unless you were on foot, and maybe not even then, unless you had experience searching for places to sleep. Nash pulled back the corrugated metal flap, a corner where men had gotten careless or lazy and bolts were rusted or missing. Enough he could flex it outward and crawl past the steel frame. Inside was dark, but not black. Electricity still flowed. He'd explored deeper once before and knew that 200 yards away, 1,000,000 square feet from him on the other side of countless stacks and shelves, men worked and lived. A single security light burned and cast its sickly glow across the narrow aisles made by rows of shelving and stacked crates. He shivered, picked up an iron bar like a bar, and waited until he was sure no monsters were following him in. He heard voices, distant but perfectly clear. It seemed impossible. It was only because he'd been here before that he suspected they were real. He couldn't suddenly have super hearing, yet would have sworn he could hear dust drifting to the floor from where he'd stirred the air. He'd chosen the warehouse as refuge because of the small apartment someone had left behind. Not much more than a closet, perhaps a watchman's quarters, but a space with a cot and a chair and a small bathroom, a sink and a toilet, enough room to wash in clean, if cold running water, and to void the chemicals and substances he was sometimes forced to eat and drink, a small lamp, and a stack of books. He'd slept here enough times he'd read them all. Mark Twain and Jules Verne and Edgar Rice Burroughs, fantastic tales that had comforted him as a boy. He spun around the room, but saw no monsters. He froze in place, heard whispers and footsteps. It took moments to decide. They might be echoes of his own breaths and movements. Still, they carried on a long time. He was drenched. He'd strip off these wet clothes, crawl under the threadbare blanket onto the cot, and pray the drugs he'd taken had a short half-life. Shingo hit the bag with a rapid-fire set of kicks and punches. He'd found the isolated workout space months ago and kept it secret, slowly outfitting it with punching bags, makiwara, and even a wall of mirrors where he could criticize his form. Whatever the room had been originally, it was virtually soundproof, and he could scream and shout without fear of being heard. A refuge where he could take out his frustrations. He seemed to be the only one who wasn't sure creating monsters was a good idea. He knew it was his duty to follow his father's wishes, but when the man strapped to the table looked at him, he'd fought the urge to scream, not so much from fear, but from knowledge that what they were doing was wrong. Twice he'd steeled himself to confront his father, and twice he'd been rebuked and finally ignored. He let the anger fuel him, punishing his body with harder and more difficult tasks. He spun as his foot rocketed out, catching the bag just over his own height, the impact still visible on the bag when his other foot slammed into it. 3 punches, traditional karate reverse punches, and a spinning back fist. The bag barely moved. At 12 years old and just over 100 pounds, he didn't have near the power he would in the future. He looked to his 2 swords. Maybe another half hour of work. He'd be exhausted enough to get some sleep. Funakoshi looked up to the monitors where his world was reduced to black and white. He'd watched the men working, geniuses and visionaries, yet none with the foresight to glean the ultimate plan, the true mission he'd been entrusted with. The world had changed from one of honor to one of unimaginable greed on a scale that dwarfed the empires that came before. Capitalism and greed were badges worn with pride, and Americans were among the most decorated. Sent as a young man to complete his studies at America's renowned School of Technology and Engineering, his masters recognized that America's appetite for illicit drugs represented the greatest money machine ever devised, a sign the American dream wasn't quite as bright and shiny as it seemed. If he'd had 1,000 men working on 1,000 printing machines, he doubted they could print money as fast as the Americans threw it at them. Funakoshi watched it play out in his mind. His status and power was about to take a monumental leap forward. With the success of their research, the cementing of their operations on American shores, and the acquisition of the sword. And now they had a line on the Sword of Earth. With the two swords reunited for the first time in more than 300 years, his power would be too great to deny. He'd soon be welcomed home with open arms and honor. The cinema of his imagination cleared as he watched Nakamura arrive. The man knew he was being watched. He exited the black town car, holding the large metal briefcase in one hand and the sword in the other, bowed to the camera, and entered the building. Funakoshi pushed himself away from his desk. He hoped the mythical sword would inspire his men to even greater heights and loyalty. Perhaps now he could share his true mission with his son. Now, where was a Shingo? Okay, like always, a couple mistakes. He picked up the bar and held it like a bar. No, he picked it up and held it like a bat. But I'm trying to get used to doing full takes and pushing forward. And part of this is training myself and sharing the process with you. So hopefully this is fun for you. I'd love you to subscribe and like the video. And please comment. And if you have any resources that you found really help you on your journey, or people you just admire, please feel free to drop them in the comment. And, this is about creating a community where we all grow and push and inspire each other. So, on to Chapter 11.